Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the What's Up Wednesday Digital Preservation, What Libraries Need to Know webinar, a panel discussion with Justin Clark, the Digital Initiatives Director at the Indiana Historical Bureau and Chair of the InDiPres, Charla Gilbert, Director of the Vincennes University Library, Treasurer of the Academic Librarians of Indiana, and Chair-elect of the InDiPres, and Janice Gustaferro, Metadata Librarian at Butler University. My name is George Bertram, and I am the Southwest Regional Coordinator from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office, and I'll be the question moderator today. I'd like to start off the webinar with a few quick announcements. To register for other webinars or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. This session is 1 hour, so you'll receive 1 LEU for today. If you are watching an archived recording of this webinar, the instructions on how to obtain your LEU are available in the video's description on YouTube. Or you can find those instructions on the ISL's continuing education site under the LEU policies. I will now turn the presentation over to Justin, Charla, and Janice.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have so many people on this day where it's snowy out, and people are probably some are in the office, some are at home. I'm at home. Big snowflakes flying around outside. But thank you so much for being here to learn a little bit about digital preservation. Next slide, please. So first, I'd just like to kind of tell you about what we do here in terms of our digital initiatives for Indiana, for those not just for preservation, but for access. So first, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about our two access initiatives. So the first is Indiana Memory, which was launched in 2008, and it's our digital platform for Indiana's cultural heritage. We collaborate with libraries and cultural heritage institutions all across the state to do the digitization work. I work with them directly. I teach them how to scan stuff. I teach them how to create metadata. I teach them how to add everything into a content management system, which for the vast majority is Content DM. And we have this web portal, which you can see on the left side of the slide there, that provides access where you can search for anything and everything Indiana history, or anything and everything and anything that was digitized by an Indiana-based institution. So sometimes our collections are actually even about things that have nothing to do with Indiana, even broadens out, which is kind of cool. Next slide, please. So we have over 150 partners with Indiana Memory, and like I said, they're all across the state. A lot of them are local public libraries, historical societies, and other institutions like private organizations or nonprofits or any other kind, university libraries, academic libraries, of course. Oh, thanks, George, in the chat there. And so we have a variety of different institutions that feed into this system. We have well over 400 plus collections, over 600,000 items roughly. We use Content DM Responsive, which is this sort of new version of Content DM, which is our content management system, or CMS, where we display our images and metadata for researchers and the general public, web interface, integrated features. And we also work from non-Content DM sources. So those of you who might be familiar with other content management systems like Omeka or Past Perfect, if you're a museum or local historical society generally, that also is a good CMS to use as well, and can be harvested by Indiana Memory. And I would assume some of you who might be from out of state also have your own sort of statewide digital initiatives that you feed into. Next slide, please. The next one I'll tell you a little bit about is Hoosier State Chronicles. This is our digital newspaper program, which is how I got my start in the digitization space back in 2016 when I worked on the National Digital Newspaper Program, which is called Chronicling America, which is a joint program between the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. But Hoosier State Chronicles was launched in 2011. Like I said, it's a component of Chronicling America, or the National Digital Newspaper Program, which was launched in 2004. It is a digital platform for Indiana's historical newspapers. And like with Indiana Memory, we collaborate with libraries and cultural heritage institutions all across the state to digitize newspapers from every corner of the state of Indiana. And like Indiana Memory, it has a web portal for access, which you can see on the left-hand side. Next slide, please. And then hit it again, because I think I got another image. If I don't, I may not. Okay, I don't. Sorry. Okay, so HoosierStateChronicles.org. We have nearly 300 titles, over 155,000 issues, 1.3 million plus pages. It's actually almost 1.4 that go from 1804 to 2018. And again, from all over the state, it's text searchable and downloadable in both JPEGs and PDFs. So that is what we do for access, right? Next slide, please. Oh, there it is. There's my images. Maybe you can see the search there. Very good. Perfect. Thank you so much. Now, one thing that institutions don't often know is that there's a difference between access and preservation. So a lot of times people think that when, oh, we'd like to add this to your archive. Well, Indiana Memory isn't really an archive, and neither is Hoosier State Chronicles. They're web platforms that provide access to the researchers, the historians, genealogists, and the general public, but it doesn't really preserve the newspapers, because some of the formatting that we use for our access versions of materials is not actually a preservation standard format. So for example, generally when you digitize materials, you will digitize them in what is called a TIFF format, which is a lossless, meaning it doesn't lose its resolution. Think of it as, think of it as sort of like a vinyl record compared to a CD where it's compressed. And so a TIFF is generally what most things are scanned into. Well, we don't have TIFFs archived generally on Hoosier State Chronicles, nor do we have them on our Content DM instance for Indiana Memory. So the best high quality, high preservation format is generally not something we save. Also, if, let's say, for example, OCLC, which is the parent company of Content DM, let's say their server goes down and we lose the collections there. Again, there's really no way to generally retrieve them if OCLC has a full wide blackout of their services. Same with DL Consulting, which is the company that we use for Hoosier State Chronicles. So when it goes into Chronicles, or goes in Indiana Memory, or it goes into your state's or your local historical society or library's digital collection, you're really only providing access. Preservation is the other component. And digitization really requires those two components to go hand in hand. So what is digital preservation? It's defined as any planning and activity that helps ensure long-term access to existing digital assets. So again, generally what this requires is making sure that you have multiple copies, and we'll get into that in a second when we describe locks. But generally what you'll need to have is multiple copies of multiple formats in multiple places. Generally, that's what you would like to have. So why is digital preservation important? Well, it's important for a variety of reasons. First off, hardware, software, and operating systems become obsolete. So I remember, years ago when I got my first external hard drive back in high school. It was a 2 terabyte hard drive. It was basically the size of a brick, and you had to plug it in. And the thing people don't generally know is that some digital assets like external hard drives and so on, they have bit rot. They they degrade over time. In my position as digital initiatives director, I have had to deal with external hard drives that had become corrupted, where I can only access some parts of the hardware. Same with software. So Content DM, which is the software we use to provide access to digital materials for folks, it has gone through a variety of updates. And in going through a variety of updates, some materials have sort of been lost in the shuffle, and we've had to sort of recoup them in a very difficult manner with OCLC to make sure we get some of those back. And I've worked on that with transferring collections from one institution to another. So let's say, for example, you have your own instance of Content DM, but your agency or historical society or library wants to save some money, and so you enter into an agreement with another library for them to house your Content DM collections. Well, in the transfer from your library to somebody else's library and their instance of Content DM, you might lose something there too. And going back to the hardware thing with external drives, like I said, I had ones used to plug in. Now, like a 2 or 4 terabyte external hard drive is the size of a deck of cards or even smaller. So those things change all of the time. Sometimes formats will change. Sometimes when you have materials that were on CDs or floppy disks, for example. A lot of computers now, especially in state agencies or academic libraries, no longer have a floppy disk drive, or some don't even have a CD disk drive. So that's another issue for sort of how hardware and software materials can go obsolete. Changes to file formats is, like I've said, we've discussed that before. Media degradation, this happens all the time. Every time that you copy something, you generally, unless you are making a one-to-one copy, it's going to degrade over time. You'll lose, there will be bit rot with each copy that you do, especially with file formats that are not of preservation quality, like JPEGs or BMPs or whatever. And but anyway, threats to storage locations. So like I said, for example, let's say content DMs like OCLC, the parent companies, their servers go out. Let's say your library catches on fire, heaven forbid, right? But let's say you have like water damage. I used to work at the state archives. We had one day where our HVAC system was so backed up with condensation that it collapsed part of the ceiling and it got water all over some of our materials and stacks. That can happen to digital assets as well. So again, if you have digital preservation methods that work, you can avoid some of those problems. Controlled access to access. So preserved copies are almost always encrypted. And they only are provided, access is only provided to a few amount of people who can be trusted within your organization. Whereas with the access with Content DM, anybody can just do a screen cap of your image and then just have your image, right? So you have a lot more control of who doesn't have access to your collections. And all of it is generally following the LOCKSS principle, which was a principle developed by Stanford University, and it's an acronym. It stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe, which is immensely important in digital preservation and in digitization work generally, is having multiple copies in multiple places. Next slide, please. So one method, before I get into a little bit into InDiPres, one method that you can do to preserve your digitized materials is to set up your own servers on site. And generally what you would do is you would have sort of a network cloud storage, something like Amazon Web Services, where you'd have a local node that's your own network, your network access storage or NAS that would be on your site, that you would store everything on. And then that NAS would then connect to a cloud service like Amazon Web Services. So say, for example, you have it on AWS and AWS goes down, you still have your network. But if your network goes down, you still have the AWS version. Again, this is the lots of copies keep stuff safe principle. Now, generally, if you try to do a lot of this on your own, it's way more expensive, it's way more labor intensive, and it has longer term costs than working through some sort of consortium. So for example, here in Indiana, we have what's called Indiana Digital Preservation, or InDiPres. InDiPres is a collaborative project between libraries, historical societies, academic institutions all across the state of Indiana who feed into our system. And we are part of what is called the MetaArchive Network, which I'll get into a little bit more later. But why do we trust having InDiPres here in Indiana? And it was something that was started in 2016 by a group of folks kind of spearheaded by my predecessor, Connie Renfeld, and Cindy May, who formerly of Indiana State University. They really sort of spearheaded the project, and with a Library Services and Technology Act grant, they sort of got the ball rolling. And so for the last 7 years, we have been continuing to expand not only membership in InDiPres, but also the amount of materials that we have digitized through InDiPres. So it's based a lot on trust. We as institutions trust each other to do our digitization procedures up to our standards and to collaborate with one another in a sense of community, which is that second point there, to really get the job done. We provide all kinds of training and insight and guidance to all of our partners to make sure that they're doing everything correctly, and not just correctly, but more easily for them too. As new methods develop, we can also improve the way in which we can have them add materials to InDiPres and get the best out of their membership. And then institutional support. Indiana Digital Preservation is backed up by the Indiana State Library, which is the fiscal agent for the organization. I serve essentially as its treasurer. And so, we have institutional support from all across the state, like I said, from historical societies, public libraries, academic institutions, and so forth, and then other collaboratives. And then what are the benefits? Well, it's the creation of a digital preservation plan. If you sign on to a consortium like InDiPres, a lot of the work has already been done for you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if you're outside of Indiana, unfortunately, InDiPres is not at this time available to you, but there are different methods to sort of join other collaboratives that can give you the same kind of institutional and infrastructural support that InDiPres gives to its members. And like I said, we also provide grants, and it's a core activity of what we do at the State Library. Next slide, please. So we'll get into what InDiPres is on a technical level, and Janice, in a little bit, will describe kind of the process of how that works for libraries. But how does InDiPres really work? Well, like I said, we're part of the MetaArchive Network, and what the MetaArchive Network is it's an off-site dark archive of digital files. So it's an extra layer of security in the case of internal issues like fire, flooding, etc. So what do we mean by dark archive? A dark archive is an archive that has been, zipped, it has been encrypted, and it is not touched unless accessed by an administrator or member of InDiPres. So it's not something that the public accesses. It's not something that even some of your other colleagues who are not involved in the collaborative would be involved in. And we are part of that MetaArchive network. It has a decentralized server structure, so it provides multiple backups in the event of a server failure. So for example, with Indiana Digital Preservation, our node or our server for InDiPres, which is a part of the MetaArchive network, is based out of Butler University, and Janice is the head of the team there, or part of the team there, who handles that, okay? Let's say that server goes down. Well, we're a member of the MetaArchive network. So our materials have been preserved here and at other nodes within the MetaArchive network. So if ours goes down, there's another node that we can retrieve our materials from, which is a perfect way to do this. So say, for example, you want to become a member of MetaArchive, then you will have that same kind of benefit because it will provide you with the ability to retrieve your materials that you need in the event of a catastrophic failure, whether it's for your content management system or your local server or so forth. And again, works with the locks principle that we discussed earlier. Next slide, please. So InDiPres in general has 22 members. Like I said, academic libraries, public libraries, historical societies, a couple of nonprofits, businesses, and so forth. We have over 14 terabytes of archived storage. It's available to members via multiple nodes. It should be nodes, not nodes, sorry. Nodes in the MetaArchive network, as I've discussed earlier. And again, it works with a variety of CMS. So you can provide multiple backups in the event of a server failure. So for example, if you're not on Content DM, but you're on Omeka or you're on your own CMS that you've developed at your institution, you can still, create preservation quality images and metadata that you can then add into your digital preservation plan via InDiPres, or if you're a member of the MetaArchive network, which, if you're a member of InDiPres, you're in MetaArchive, but you don't have to be in InDiPres to be a part of MetaArchive. You can actually develop your own digitization plan with MetaArchive or another digitization organization that collaborates with libraries to do this kind of work. And so MetaArchive is the one that I have the most experience with, so it's the one I can speak to. But you can definitely be a part of MetaArchive and not be a part of InDiPres, because if you're outside of the state or something like that. And one of the things about costs that I guess I didn't really put in my slides, but I think is kind of important. Generally, it's going to cost an institution more money to develop their own digital preservation infrastructure than to join on to an existing plan like MetaArchive, because you're going to be spending thousands of dollars setting up your own network, setting up your own servers, setting up your own setting up your own digitization infrastructure that you might need. Whereas if you go with MetaArchive, you will pay a yearly fee to be a part of MetaArchive, and you pay for your storage as well. But it's infinitely cheaper to go that route. But if you're a smaller institution, you don't have that much, then you can do other forms of digital preservation. Say, for example, let's say you do have a sort of network storage at your site, you can have a preservation file there. You can then again, you can encrypt or bag those materials, which Janice will get into later. You can only provide certain people with administrator access. And then of course, you can also put everything on external drives somewhere else. My apologies for that. But anyway, so yeah, so there's a variety of different things that you can do if let's say you're not part of a consortium, but being a part of something like InDiPres or MetaArchive is certainly worthwhile. And I highly encourage folks to look into whether their state or their region has something like InDiPres and see if they can join that. And if not, then I highly encourage you to look into MetaArchive and the services that it provides, because they are a wonderful partner for us with the InDiPres network, and they do incredible work. And like I said, it will be far cheaper for you to go that route than it will be to set up your own digital infrastructure generally. And so those are kind of the options that are available to you, both in Indiana and not. And I'm happy to clarify anything in the question and answer period. Next slide, please. And then I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Janice, who's going to tell you about the process of preservation.
Hello, good morning. Again, I'm Janice Gustaferro, and I work at Butler University. And currently, InDiPres's staging and lock servers are at our institution, which is why I'm involved in this. And so in this part of the presentation, I'll cover the steps that each InDiPres member takes to get their content into the InDiPres staging server, as well as the process that takes place to get the content from the staging server into the MetaArchive network. Next slide, please. So there are 4 basic steps that you would need to do as an InDiPres member. You will select the content that needs this higher level of digital preservation that MetaArchive provides. You'll prepare your content, bag it, and send it to the server. And in the next slide, please, I'll go over each of these steps in a little bit more detail. So when selecting your content and prioritizing which collections or groups of content you want to preserve, you want to consider potential risks to the content and factors such as your institution's policies or maybe any requirements for digital preservation, and the uniqueness and significance of the content. And there's more detail available in the InDiPres guidance document and technical appendix that you can find on the InDiPres website under Member Tools. So next slide, please. So the next part is to prepare all of your content. So when you pull your files together for preservation, you'll want to include all of the documentation that would be needed to put a digital collection or repository back together again in the future in the event of some disaster. So in addition to the digital content files, you'll want to preserve the metadata for each item and any other notes or information about that digital collection, such as maybe how the fields were mapped or whatever you would need in the future. And it might not even be you, so somebody else would need to know to put it back together again. And just a note I want to make is that when you're recreating a digital collection, it's much easier if each digital content file can be matched with its associated metadata. And please note that even though you would have specified the content file name when you initially loaded each item, metadata exports from some systems, such as ContentDM, do not include the content file name unless you included a field with this information in your metadata when you created the collection. So that's something to keep in mind when you're creating collections and creating your metadata. The next thing I want to mention is that InDiPres recommends that files be named starting with a prefix that identifies your institution and the collection. And there are bulk renaming tools that can help you with adding these prefixes if you need to. And also the file name should not include any spaces or special characters, although underscores and dashes can be used. And again, there are more details on file naming in that section 1 of that InDiPres guidance document that I mentioned earlier. And as Justin alluded to, at some point in the future, it's likely that our existing file formats will need to be migrated to newer formats. So in order to make this migration easier, it's best to use standard, commonly used file formats, and preferably ones that are not proprietary. Next slide, please. So then we get to bagging the content. So once you've assembled all of your relevant files, it's time to bag the content. And bagging organizes the content for automated data ingest and provides a way to check that the transfer has been successful. And a bag is similar to a folder or a directory. It contains the digital content files that you're preserving, text files that describe the bag and its contents, and the checksums that were generated during bagging. And at InDiPres, most of us have been using the Library of Congress's bagging software, but there are other options available, and we can help you with training on using this software. Either there are videos, there's documentation, or I could do one-on-one sessions with you. Happy to do that. And similar to the file names, the bag name should start with a prefix that identifies your institution and the collection. And there are no exact size limitations, but it's best not to send extremely large bags. Usually 30 gigabytes or so would be a reasonable size. So if you've got a really large collection, you'll probably have to send multiple bags for that collection. Next slide, please. So the last step then is to just send the bags to the staging server. And we're currently using ReadyCloud to send files to the InDiPres staging server. So when you're ready to do this for the first time, we'll send you the information needed to set up your ReadyCloud account. And then we'll link your account to a folder for your institution. Oh, wait, I'm seeing the chat here. Is there a preferred bagger software than any? We've lately, as I mentioned, have been using the Library of Congress's bagger software, although we're considering looking into Dart as an option too. But I think it's really up to you as long as it works with the MetaArchive system. And that's what, before we start recommending Dart, I think we'll do a test run with MetaArchive to make sure that I assume it'll work, but we haven't tried it yet. Some people have used Exactly though in the past. Thank you for the question. Although I should probably go on and we'll do questions at the end. Sorry about that. When you're, we'll set up this folder for your institution on the staging server. And essentially then in the future, all you need to do is drag and drop bags into a folder on your end, and they will arrive at your institution's folder on the staging server at Butler. And so please let your contact at Butler, and at this time it would be me, know when you've sent the bags and are ready to have them ingested into the network. And if possible, please let us know the sizes of the bags and the names. So next slide, please. So that what I just went through is essentially what you would need to do as an InDiPres member, but I thought you might be interested in what goes on after you've sent the bags to the staging server. So once it's there, then me for now, will set up archival units. I'll enter information into the MetaArchive software to create these archival units or AUs, and they're essentially pointers to the bags on the staging server, which allows other servers in the network to access the information for testing and ingest. So MetaArchive is notified then to pull the bags to the test server and run tests. And when those are successful, then 5 MetaArchive lock server administrators in geographically diverse locations will be notified to pull the bags from the InDiPres staging server and ingest them into their lock servers. And when this ingest process is complete, when I hear that everyone's got the content saved, then the bags will be deleted from the InDiPres staging server to make room for more bags on the staging server. Next slide, please. So this is pretty much just a graphical representation of what I went through, shows the whole process. So as an InDiPres member, you'll send bags to the staging server. The test server will pull them and test it. And then when that's successful, 5 MetaArchive lock servers will pull and store the content where it will be safely monitored, repaired if needed, and will be available to pull out should that become necessary. InDiPres also has a lock server, as Justin mentioned, and we use other members of MetaArchive will use that for their content as well. And MetaArchive continues to make changes to the process as needed. We have one possible future change, which would be to use a service offered by the Internet Archive to stage content prior to testing. That's still in a pilot stage though. And then another point I want to make is that as an InDiPres member, you have the opportunity to participate in the MetaArchive community, and you can join committees, and the people are very supportive and helpful, and your participation can help you to learn more about digital preservation. So next slide, please. So just a little bit more information. There's a link here to the, and we'll send these slides later, the MetaArchive website, InDiPres website, and how to get to that guidance document that I mentioned. But please feel free to ask Justin or Charla or me if you've got any questions. We're happy to help. So thank you for your attention on this part. And then next, Charla will talk about her experience as a relatively new member of InDiPres. So go ahead, Charla.
Thank you, Janice. She's absolutely right. I'm very, very new to this. With everyone having, cuts to their budget, I've taken a lot of the role of attempting to learn how to archive things in our library along with everything else. And I just, at first I was very, very intimidated. I don't know how all of you feel, but when you've not ever had an experience of doing some of this stuff, even just not the digitization part, not just like, okay, I'm going to put this slide into a machine and I'm going to make it a TIFF file, but the overwhelming feeling that you get when you decide that, hey, we're going to scan all of our yearbooks, which is the first project that we did. And there was a lot of work to that, from the naming conventions and doing it the way that is needed for ingestion. I can't seem to speak today, all the way to learning these new processes, such as the bagging that Janice mentioned, and InDiPres in particular. I feel so fortunate to, have their support, because I knew absolutely nothing. So it was really great to work with them. There's videos that shows us how to do things, and bless Janice when I call her up and say, okay, can you just please spend half an hour with me going over this? Because I want to make sure I don't want to mess it up and have to do it all over again. And she was absolutely wonderful in helping me, set that up. That personal one-on-one makes a big difference for somebody who really don't have a network of this sort of thing within my own library, because besides me, I only have one other librarian. They didn't allow me to rehire an open position earlier last year. So anyway, having that support as we're trying something new is very important. And while I know the state library and the work that they do uses Content DM, due to cost, we did choose to use Omeka and for our own access, but that's worked out really well and fairly easy to use as well. One of the things that I wrote down as Justin was talking too was about the fact that we did have everything on our hard drives, and technology fails. And so that was one of the reasons that I started to become interested in InDiPres, and then of course MetaArchives with the locks process, is because with our processes, a lot of this stuff, as we're making those scans, as we're working on that metadata, as new content comes along in the many millions of, it feels like millions, I know it's not, but from the side scanning to videos to cassettes and all this stuff that we've been kind of processing, I've got a lot of staff holding on to a lot of these hard drives for a variety of reasons. And I mean, they need access to that. I'm not saying they don't, but as we all know, the more hands that touch this stuff and the more use that we start having of some of this stuff, it started to become a large concern on my, what do I do with this? What happens if we, heaven forbid, do have that fire? But what happens if, I have a student that accidentally hits delete on the wrong folder? Didn't that just make your heart stop just a little bit? But there's lots of pans in the fire. So I think it's another really good reason that once you finished a project and you're sending it off, you don't have that worry that in 5 years or whatever amount of time that, you know, something happens to that hard drive or someone misplaces it, someone takes it home, their dog ate it. Lots and lots of reasons why we do that. But it just, and plus I have to say that for us, you know, the cost of this is affordable. At least for us, that's one of the reasons we went with Omeka, because of our content costs. But as far as using, you know, the lock system with InDiPres and MetaArchives, that felt like the right step for us too, to work with those two organizations to make sure that we have what we need to keep our stuff secure. I mean, we are over 200, our university is over 200 years old. So as you can imagine, we have quite a few things that are older that we're trying to get preserved so that we don't lose that. And being able to work and have the guidance of these great, super great individuals has really been life. And I say life changing, and everyone's like, oh yeah, life's changing, whatever. It has. It's made me feel a lot more comfortable with what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, and feeling like I'm doing the right thing for our library, for our university. So I don't know that nobody wants to hear everything that we've been doing as far as that, but I want to mention one thing that I think it was Justin that mentioned, or maybe it was Janice, the metadata. And we keep all of our metadata on a spreadsheet when we ingest our stuff so that we have it. And we want to make sure that that kind of content also transfers over with things, so that we don't lose what we've put in and the access and what we've put in for safekeeping. So really, I can't say more how wonderful it's been to work with everyone, and always happy to talk, and probably talk too long about the kinds of things that we're doing here. But if you're considering any kind of starting of any kind of archival projects, or if you feel as intimidated as I did at the beginning, this is really a good place to start with good people. George, I'll let you take it over for the questions.
All right, thank you all three. I am going to ask now out loud, I've put it in chat a few times, if you have questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat, and I will be sure to get those to our presenters. But a few did come in, so I will go ahead and read those out now. First one, and it was, I think, specifically for Justin, it definitely came in that first section. Given that hard drives are corruptible, how often do you think we should change the hard drive, since we use them so often for archiving our work?
Great question. So one thing I would do is essentially, if you can, I would do like an annual inventory or audit and run them, make sure they're working fine. The drives that I've had go out are ones that are anywhere between 5 and 10 years old. So I would recommend around maybe the 5-year-ish mark, reviewing your drives and seeing if you need to replace them. And again, you don't have to do it all at once. So like if you know, for example, that like some drives are older than others, then you can sort of keep an inventory. So anytime you buy a new drive, you kind of note like the manufacturer date on that, and then kind of go forward. But yeah, I would say about 5 years is when you may want to start looking into replacing some of them. I don't recommend, and I don't think it's like budgetarily feasible or whatever, like to replace them all, but like basically every year, so just review them and make sure they're doing okay. And then within 5 years, you may want to consider getting rid of some of your older drives, especially ones like, it's also very good, I think, to get rid of drives that require power. So like older ones where you have to actually plug them in, those are the ones that tend to have more problems, because in the one that I was working with, the power component of the drive kind of shorted out. And I had to sort of finagle a way to get it plugged into my computer so I could pull stuff off of it before it went completely kaput. So yeah, I think, you know, like I said, 5 years is generally when you want to start looking into replacing some of them. But I would always do an inventory of them and then just sort of check them on an annual basis. And I actually recommend you do that for any digitization equipment that you have. Is just keep an actual detailed inventory of what you've got, review what you have, see what things need to be replaced, and just have those kind of conversations, whether it's with your library board or with your library staff or some kind of equipment committee. We have an equipment committee here at the State Library that we're developing to sort of look into buying materials. So, so that's kind of what I would do. So short answer, about 5 years, I would start looking at replacing some of them, but always look at them on an annual basis.
All right, great, thanks. Next question, when the stuff is ingested by the 5 locks, is it always the same 5 servers, or are there, you know, I guess how many are there and how does that kind of work?
No, it is not necessarily always the same 5 ones. It would, there are networks, there are nodes in Spain, Brazil, I believe, and a number of places throughout the US. And the idea is to have them in geographically diverse locations. So I think what happens is anytime I ask MetaArchive to go ahead and ingest them, they will look at what's, which servers, you know, haven't had one for a while, or they'll just look at the locations, what's available now, and they do spread it out. So it's not always the same one. And there are, I can't remember exactly how many, I think 16 or 18 MetaArchive members at this point. And so it would be one of, you know, 5 of those.
Great. Well, those are the 2 questions that came in during the presentation. So I'll remind everyone again, if you have a question, go ahead and drop that in the chat. And while we are waiting on that, I am going to grab the URL for the LEU request form. So any librarians in Indiana, or if you're in a state that has certification requirements, if you need a certificate from today, I want to remind everyone to be sure and fill that form out. And if there are other questions, we'll all be glad to stick around and talk about this more. I want to thank Justin, Charla, and Janice again for presenting today, and remind everyone that the recording will be available shortly. I will get it out to everyone who is here presently, as well as everyone who didn't make it today, and it will go up on the Indiana State Library's archive webinars page sometime, probably next week or a little after. And again, one more chance to ask questions. Feel free to drop those in the chat. All right, well, mostly we're getting thank yous, so I'm going to have Lisa stop the recording. But